Okay, welcome back to another episode of Mr. M Rocks. This is lesson 9 in our PhatKids series. It's an ActionScript 3 tutorial that is constructing a tower defense game. And so in the last lesson, we left it off where if I run the program will allow us to grab guys from the menu, these little toys, and they come out and they're going to follow the mouse. What we want them to do is we want them to follow the enemies. Something I forgot to mention on the last video is how are these enemies actually coming out randomly like this. So I wanted to go back and just kind of point out that code. That's coming on down here, and where did I do that? Here it is, enemy. So I've got private function init enemy just like before, but now I have if send enemy equals true, and I'm using a switch statement. Now this could all be tucked away neatly into its own private little method, and maybe I'll do that later on, but right now I'm using a switch statement which works very much like an if-else statement or a chain of if-elses where it says switch random enemy. So I'm using the math random function. I'm getting 4 numbers. This part that I have highlighted would give me 0, 1, 2, and 3. So by adding 1, I'll get the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 randomly. And whatever the result is, I'm going to go ahead and use here. And case is going to be either 1, 2, 3, or 4. And we put in a default just for whatever reason. I'm off by 1 or something. I have a default setting, but case 1 is enemy is a new enemy 1. And notice enemy 1 is taking in waypoints. And so if I were to go back here and look at enemy 1 in my, let's see, enemy 1 is this guy right here, my soda pop. So if I were to look at that code, one thing that's really important that we have to pay attention to is that enemy 1 extends enemy, but it receives in an array of waypoints. And it has to send that to the super. So my super enemy is going to receive the same array. Remember, we have inside each of the enemies, it keeps track of all of the individual waypoints inside the enemy. And so since I'm choosing now 4 different enemies, I need to send my waypoints to each of the individual 4, and then through the super constructor, when I construct the super, it will also get that same array of waypoints. And so at this time, I can say I'm going to get either enemy 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. I'm sending in the waypoints here, and everything else should be exactly the same as it was before. I also want to mention that for this to work, I needed to put my declaration for enemy up on top, and that's all I need to do to take care of my enemies. Now the turret is going to be quite a bit different. What I want to do is have the turret no longer follow the mouse. And so what I'll do is right here, I'm going to get rid of these guys, and I'll kind of start over from scratch. The first thing I need to do is I need to pay attention to my enemies array. Now I have an enemies array back in PhatKids, and I want to make use of that. And so I'm going to create an array here. I'll just call it E, and what I want to do is say E equal to enemies. But enemies doesn't exist in this class. And so what I need to do is somehow reference back to the PhatKids class. And the way that I do that is I go ahead and tell ActionScript that my root or my document class, I'm going to say root as PhatKids again. And now this should tell ActionScript that sort of the bottom layer of this program is PhatKids, and I can go there and I can find enemies, and now E, which is also an array, is going to be pointing to or referencing that same array that I have back in PhatKids, and that's going to be useful. Now what I want to do as I go through this is I'm going to loop through everything in E. So I'll use a for loop, and for loops work really well with arrays, and I need to create a counter or a control variable, so I'll just simply say var I is going to be an int, and it will be set equal to 0. And then I'll say I has got to be less than e dot length. So however long e is, it's always going to go from 0 to one less than the length of E. So let's say E has 10 elements. This will go from 0 to 9, which is 10 elements, but remember the indices always start at 0, and then I'll simply say I plus plus. And so that's going to loop through all of the different enemies. And what I'm going to do in this loop is I'm going to look for the closest enemy. And so I've got up here the shortest distance. Before I go through the loop, I can set my shortest distance equal to, I don't know, let's say the shortest distance is going to be equal to 1,000, because I know that no enemy will ever be more than 1,000 pixels away. Probably there's some constant like max int in ActionScript. I can look that up, but for right now we'll just use that guy. And so what I'll do is I will, every single time I come in here, I'm going to find the distance to the enemy. And so I've got this variable called DTE. I've set him up here. I'm going to call DTE is short for distance to enemy. And I'm going to write a function that's going to simply get the distance to that enemy, or to whatever enemy I happen to pass through. So I'll go through each element in the array, and I'm going to pass to this method that I'm going to create the distance to that, or I'll pass that particular enemy. So that's simply going to be E, and I use the square brackets to reference the ith element. And so at that point, that'll give me the distance I want. Now I have to check and see if that's the shortest distance. So if I say if DTE is less than, and I'm going to take this shortest distance here. So if the whatever the distance is between my turret and this element, the ith element of the array, if it's closer than the current one, I'm going to go ahead and reset this. And so to do that, I need to pay attention to two things. I need to pay attention to shortest distance. Since this number DTE is less than shortest distance, I will reset that to DTE. And I'll let my current enemy be equal to I. So whatever element is closest to my turret, that's the element that my turret is going to be pointing to. And that's good to go. So once I've done that, let's see, I think I can break out of the for loop at this point. So I know I'm pointing at the ith element, whichever one is closest to my turret, and so then all I have to do is set up my rotation. And to set up my rotation, we've done this before. I'm going to say variable dx. I've got to find the distance, the x distance and the y distance, and use those in the rotation. So I'll go ahead and say number, and this is going to be equal to the x coordinate of the turret minus, and I'll say E, and I'm going to reference the current enemy. So remember, the current enemy is pointing to whichever enemy is closest. And I'm going to do the same thing for y. As I do this for both the x and the y values, this is going to give me the horizontal and vertical distance to the closest enemy. And then I just go back and I use rotation, which is the rotation of the turret, because I'm in the turret class. So I'll say rotation is equal to, and I want math dot a 10(2), and all I need to do is pass it in dy and dx. So I'll say dy, the horizontal or the vertical distance, and dx, the horizontal distance. And then, since this is going to hand back radian value, I need to convert that to degrees, because rotation wants degrees. And so I'll simply say math.pi, and I'm going to multiply that by 180. Now for some reason, I'm not exactly sure why, this is going to be 180 degrees off. So if I add 180 degrees here, instead of having the back of the turret point to the object, I'll have the front of it. Now this is all pretty good, except I don't have this function written yet, so I need to write this. And this function, I'm sending it an enemy, and I'm returning an integer value. And so right after this function, I'm going to come in between two of my functions, and I'm going to create distance to enemy. Now I actually have that down here because I've already written it, but notice it receives in an enemy, and it's going to pass back a number. Could pass back an integer, but I just wrote this with number. So it's going to receive in an enemy, and I take, again, I define a variable dx for my horizontal distance, and this says the x coordinate of the turret minus the x coordinate of this particular enemy. Remember, I'm sending in an enemy, and I take the vertical distance between the turret and the enemy, and once I have the x and the y differences to find, this is just the Pythagorean theorem, dx times dx plus dy times dy, and I take the square root of that, and that gives me the distance between the x and the coordinates of the turret and the coordinates of the enemy. Let's go ahead and see if this runs. Looks like there's no immediate problems, and so if I run this guy, notice that my turret is not turning. And so if I look back up here, let's see what's going on. I've got the shortest distance, that all looks right. The rotation, that looks right. The rotation is equal to all of this, and I think that all looks right. So I'm not sure. I think I'll have to look at it, stop the movie, and then come back. Okay, I made a silly mistake down here where I've got all of my checking for my looping through here worked fine. Checked the distance, all of this worked fine. The only problem with the video was right here where it says dx number equals x. So I had the x coordinate of this, which is the turret, and the y coordinate of the turret. I simply had forgotten to put dot x and dot y here. So I found that by just taking a little bit closer look. And so that actually works pretty well now. At this point, if I were to run the program, I'll notice that as the enemies come out, this guy and all of these guys are going to point to the most current or the closest enemy, whichever one happens to be closest. And so if I hit anywhere on the play area and I hit the mouse, they shoot whatever direction they're pointing in. Now the next step in the project, and I'll save this for lesson 9, will be to have the enemies shoot whenever, the turrets shoot whenever the enemies come into range. So that will be in lesson 10. Hope you enjoy it.